You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably, with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Hello, once again, to another journey into the unexplored, unexplained, the unknown Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson.
And today we're going to actually talk about an interesting topic that I think is paranormal linked. Some people probably wouldn't, but it certainly has its connections, and you'll probably see why in a minute. It's actually phantom limbs. For those that don't know what a phantom limb is, I'm just going to give you a basic here. Say a veteran lost his leg in the war, in a battle, recovered in the hospital, but starts to have feeling of their toes. Let's say they lost their leg, but they could feel toes, or they lost their leg from, let's say, the knee down. They could feel their toes. They feel phantom pains of that part of the limb that was gone,
as if the leg was still actually there.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, to me, the question, and when I had this, and I read a few articles about this, was where does physical life end and your spiritual, metaphysical body continue?
Right.
To me, this kind of shows you there's still something that still exists, even though your physical body is gone. Because we're all made of energy.
Yes.
So I thought it would be an interesting story. So we're going to go right into phantom limbs. Now, a phantom limb, of course, is a sensation that an amputation or a missing limb is still attached. And 60 to 80% of individuals that have an amputation, they do experience sensations in their amputated limbs, and a majority of them are painful. A lot of research continues into phantom limb pain, PLP, and the treatments to control it. 80 to 100% of amputees experience some non-painful sensations. The amputee may feel strongly about the phantom limb that it's still part of the body. I think it's not that you're just used to the motion, but you want to pick something up. People say they feel their fingers even though there's nothing there. If they're having a missing hand.
And walking too. I've heard people who were missing a limb and they still feel like they could walk on it.
Yeah. To me, that's
and
wild.
they could still feel the steps, the ground.
To me, that's wild. That's pure energy then.
That is.
So people sometimes feel like they're gesturing, feel itches, twitch, even try to pick things up. The missing limb often feels shorter and may feel as if it is a distorted and painful position, and occasionally pain can be made worse by stress, anxiety, and weather changes.
Which is what it does to bones.
And metaphysical energy. Weather would change energy.
That's true too.
Phantom limb pain is usually intermittent. The frequency and intensity of the attacks usually declines over a period of time. Now, some people who have undergone gender reassignment surgery have reported this sensation of phantom genitals.
I believe that.
The reports were less common among post-operative transgender women, but did occur in transgender men. So similarly, subjects who had undergone a mastectomy reported experience phantom breasts.
I've heard of that.
These reports were substantially less common among post-operative transgender men, but did occur in transgender women. Phantom limb sensations and phantom limb pains. The term phantom limb, of course, was coined by physician Silas Ware Mitchell in 1871. For many years, the hypothesis that was dominant as the cause was an irritation in the nervous system at the amputation site. By the late 1980s, Ronald Melzack had recognized that the peripheral neuroma account could not be correct because many people born without limbs have also experienced phantom limbs. According to Melzack, the experience of the body is created by a wide network of interconnecting neural structures, which he calls neuromatrix. Now that's interesting. People who are born without limbs also experiencing phantom limbs. Now, I could see losing a limb and experiencing a phantom limb sensation, but to never have that limb yet still have the sensation, that says to me it's almost in our DNA that our body's energy is made up of certain limbs that are supposed to be there no matter what.
Yeah, they're supposed to be there, and since it's connected to the brain, the nerves from the brain connects to the nerves from, and it's telling you that this is, it's like almost autocorrect. This is what you're supposed to have. Yep. Yeah.
And it's almost fooling itself sometimes if they have that sensation of, I can feel that limb that's still there. But that's interesting. I never actually heard that before.
I've actually heard stories about people losing their hands or getting a finger chopped, and at night sleeping, automatically wanting to do something, and actually seeing a shadow or a physical aura of their actual hand, even though it's no longer there, or their actual finger.
That's wild.
Yeah.
In 1991, Tim Pons and his colleagues at the National Institutes of Health showed that the primary somatosensory cortex in macaque monkeys undergoes substantial reorganization after loss of sensory input. Hearing about these results, Vilayanagar S. Ramachandran hypothesized that phantom limb sensations in humans could be due to reorganization in the human brain's somatosensory cortex. Ramachandran and colleagues illustrated this hypothesis by showing that stroking different parts of the face led to perceptions of being touched on different parts of the missing limb. Later, brain scans of amputees showed the same kind of cortical reorganization that Pons had discovered in monkeys.
Actually, acupuncture kind of does that too. If you go to certain parts of your hands or between your fingers, it actually the nerves, you can feel certain parts of the feeling in your feet. The energy. So if anybody here is an acupuncturist and you're listening to this, you probably know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Maladaptive changes in the cortex may account for some but not all of phantom limb pain. Pain researchers such as Tamar Macon of Oxford and Marshall DeVore of Hebrew University, Jerusalem, say that they argue that the phantom limb pain is primarily the result of junk inputs from the peripheral nervous system. Despite a great deal of research on the underlying neural mechanisms of phantom limb pain, there is still no clear consensus as to the cause. Both the brain and the peripheral nervous system may be involved. Of course, research continues. Treatment over the last couple decades have shown consistent improvement. Some have included medication, antidepressants, spinal cord stimulation, vibration therapy, acupuncture, hypothesis, and biofeedback. Some reliable evidence is lacking on whether any of them are better than the other as far as the treatment goes. Most of them aren't very effective. Ketamine or morphine may be useful around the time of surgery. Morphine, of course, can help for longer periods of time. And evidence for gabapentin is mixed. Paraneural catheters that provide local anesthetic agents have poor evidence of success when placed after surgery in an effort to prevent phantom limb pain. One approach was received public interest in the use of mirror box, which provides a reflection of the intact hand or limb that allows the patient to move the phantom limb and to unclench it from potentially painful positions.
I've never heard of that.
I'm not sure I understand the concept. Let's see what it says. Although mirror therapy, so I guess you're up against a mirror.
Yeah.
I don't know how that would work, though. Although mirror therapy was introduced by Ramachandran in the early 90s, little research was done before 2009, and much of the research was poor quality. In 2018 review, which also criticized the scientific quality of many reports on mirror therapy, found 15 good quality studies conducted between 2012 and 2017 at a pool of 115 publications, and concluded that mirror therapy seems to be effective in relieving PLP, reducing the intensity and duration of daily pain. It's a valid, simple, inexpensive treatment for PLP. So it's not the end-all, do-all, or it doesn't explain it, but
it helps.
Yeah.
It helps big deal. Wow.
Other sensations, maybe after the removal of body parts other than limbs, amputation of breasts, extraction of a tooth, or removal of an eye, which is interesting.
I usually hear it when it comes to body parts. I've never really heard much about teeth or eye. Yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think, when you lose a tooth, I don't think that I have phantom limb from a tooth, but some people may.
Some people might, especially if you're used to that tooth always being there.
Yeah.
But yeah, some people might. But
now, you had some information as far as, since it's obviously energy, and this is partly why I wanted to do this show, is I still think when we die, your body is made of energy. There's still something of your body that's energy when your physical body dies. You're still, the imprint of your body is still energy. And I think that's where you said this came in as far as photography, right?
Right. There's such a thing called Kirlian. I believe it's Kirlian photography, and it's a photography where you could see the actual auric energy of the person. And actually, I've read articles where scientists did some research with it, and they actually went up to a plant and they cut the leaf or they cut the flower stem, and they actually took a picture and they could see something trying to grow in its place when the actual plant doesn't show that it's grown, but the shadow of it or the auric part are growing in its place.
So that's like this phantom limb is growing.
Right.
But not in the physical realm.
Or actually, not just the growing, but actually when the leaf or the flower is missing or the stem, they show the phantom, the actual leaf, flower, or stem, the shadow, the auric part. Even though the physical plant is gone, and that's been captured in Kirlian photography. It's a collection of techniques used to capture the phenomenon of electrical coronal discharges. It's named after Semyon Kirlian, who in 1939 accidentally discovered that if an object on a photographic plate is connected to a high voltage source, an image is produced on the photographic plate. And the technique has been variously known as electrography, photography. So electrophotography. Sorry about that. Electrography. Yes, sorry
about that. It's a hard word, folks.
It is. Right, exactly. Coronal discharge photography, electrography. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. Electrography. Sorry about that. Gas discharge visualization, electrophonetic imaging, and in Russian literature, Kirlian photography. Anyway, Kirlian photography has been the subject of scientific research and parapsychology research, and the claims have been made about the photography, but the claims are unsupported by the scientific community. To a large extent, it's been used in alternative medicine research, but actually, in the past few years, the scientific community have been actually doing some experiments with it.
What's interesting, though, is I noticed in reading part of that article and another one I found, I think it almost got a bad rap because the metaphysical parapsychologists sort of clung to this.
Right.
And it sort of scared away all the real scientists.
Right,
which is kind of a shame.
It is a shame, yeah.
Because there is proof of it, but parapsychologists take it and run with it and say, this is what it is, this is what it does, this is the hard, cold facts about what this is, when that's not always the case, because parapsychologists have a way of bending information to fit their needs sometimes, support their needs, I guess.
I guess one of the first experiments with it was in 1889. Sheikh B. Navratil. He came up with the word Electrography, yes. Sorry about that. 7 years later, in 1896, a French experimenter named H. Baraduc, he created electrographs of hands and leaves. And then in 1898, this Polish engineer, Jakub Narkowicz, he demonstrated at the 5th exhibition of the Russian Technical Society some photos of Karelian photography.
Well, I know a lot of them were fingertips of males and females to see the differences.
Right.
You can see the electrical discharges from the tips of the fingers. To me, that just shows energy. It's energy. We emote energy. Are energy.
It's energy, but in 1939, two Czechs, S. Pratt and J. Schlemmer, they published photos showing a glow around leaves, which is the auric view around leaves. And the same year, Russian electrical engineer Semyon Karelian and his wife Valentina, they developed the Karelian photography after observing a patient in Krasnodar Hospital who was receiving medical treatment from a high-frequency electrical generator. They noticed that when the electrodes were brought near the patient's skin, there was a glow similar to that of a discharge tube. So that was probably the auric glow they were looking at. And they conducted experiments in which the film was placed on top of a conducting plate, and another conductor was attached to a hand, a leaf, or a plant material. And the conductors were energized by high-frequency, high-voltage power source producing photographic images, typically showing a silhouette of the object surrounded by an aura of light. So there's later experiments. In 1958, the Karelians reported the results of their experiments for the first time. And their work was virtually unknown until 1970 when two Americans, Lynn Schroeder and Sheila Ostrander, published a book called Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain. And high-voltage electrophotography soon became known to the general public as Karelian photography. So although little interest was generated among Western scientists, the Russians actually held a conference on the subject in 1972 at Kazan State University. It became, so they started taking it seriously after the book got published, and it was used in the former Eastern Bloc in the 1970s, Karelian photography, and the corona discharge glow at the surface of an object subject to a high voltage electrical field was referred to as Karelian aura in Russian and Eastern Europe. But in 1975, scientist Viktor Adamenko, he wrote a dissertation titled "Research of the Structure of High-Frequency Electrical Discharge Images," and there was a scientific study of what the researchers called the Karelian effect, which was conducted by Viktor Inyushin at Kazan State University. So they started taking it seriously, and they started doing more experiments. And then in the 1970s, Thelma Moss and Kendall Johnson at the Center of Health Science at UCLA conducted research into Karelian photography. Moss led the independent parapsychology laboratory, unsupported parapsychology laboratory, which wasn't supported by a lot of scientists, a lot of science, and it was shut down by the university in 1979, which I think is a shame.
You know what's interesting about this?
Yeah.
Is you kind of see how it's gone so far. They have a start of something they found, but no one's really said, well, what can we use it for?
Right.
What good is it?
Right.
But you know what I'm thinking about is they're desperately now trying to find ways to regrow limbs to replace missing limbs.
Yeah.
And I bet you anything, when they start really getting into that, they're going to start finding out more about this. Photography,
and they're going to revisit the subject,
and they're going to find out the reason that happens. Like, that's almost like a DNA blueprint in energy.
It is totally
that where the physical thing should have been, or in this case, if it's gone, it's trying to grow back. That doesn't necessarily mean we grow back, but that could be our DNA. Like when we crawled from the water, or we grew limbs as we evolved.
I agree with that.
Maybe that is a part of that we don't do it anymore, but our instincts in our body actually has the idea that we can grow something back, even though we can't.
It's like a blueprint, and you know, this was the late 1970s. I think with the technology, the way it's evolved, and with the way we do photography from our phones, and the way we evolve the way we can find out things.
Well, X-rays,
X-rays, everything. I mean, everything's evolved since then. I think they're going to revisit this subject if they haven't already. And I think
that's how, that when they go to grow limbs and they really study how they grow, and as they grow, they're going to look at the energy around it. They're going to look at everything possible. They're going to start focusing on this more and go, oh, this person found this years ago.
Let's look into this
again. But now that we're growing limbs for a person to then have it reconnected to their body, because it's using their tissue to regrow a limb, maybe then that aura will completely fill out once that limb's reattached. That would be interesting to see.
It would be, and especially you know how doing your DNA is so popular now, and they show you the blueprint. They show you what it looks like, the lines, and I bet you anything, a lot of doctors and scientists who look at DNA lines and blueprints would actually want to take that study even further, because now they have health studies, not just your ancestry studies, but health studies. You look at your DNA blueprint, find out what health problems you have. And I bet you anything that they could take that a step further and figure out how,
There's so much we don't know. I mean, there's so much of the human body we still don't know.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that they poo-poo this, to me, it's like they poo-poo it because they can't see a purpose for it.
Right.
So it's like, well, it's just this weird little thing. It doesn't really mean anything. It could be a combination of different things in your body. Let's push it to the side. Obviously, parapsychologists, I thought, whoa, this is kind of this is an energy imprint of your body limbs, even though your limb isn't there. And that's fascinating that it would grow, even though your physical body limb would no longer be able to grow back. So I think somewhere in the future, they will marry those two together.
Right.
We may not have the answers all the way.
No.
But I think we'll learn more because of that.
They'll start taking a second look, and they'll start connecting the two together. If they haven't already, they probably already have, and we don't know it. But I hope so. It would actually. I think it's worth looking into, because.
Absolutely. Well, I'm sure they will when they get to that point.
Yeah.
Here's a couple descriptions from people who've lost limbs that have phantom limbs pain. One says, if I flex familiar muscles, I could feel the relative parts of my foot touching the red latex barrier. She said, shortly after this red balloon realization, I began to experience real sensations that every amputee is familiar with. At first, it's a burning. I swore I could feel my foot crisping as my leg reacted to the nerve pain, and it would stay ignited for hours.
Oh, wow.
So that sounds like energy to me, desperately trying to regrow or reform. It feels like lightning bolts shooting up and down my residual limb, and it feels like a throbbing, cutting off circulation sensation, just to name a few. So that's an interesting. And I found a story. It's written by an anonymous person in May of 2019, this year, about an experience they had. And I wanted to relay this because I thought it was fascinating. They said, my arm was amputated and something really weird is happening with my phantom limb. Something terrible happened after they operated on me. People ask how I lost my arm. They usually ask in a hushed tone, trailing off at the last few words as if sheltering me from the loss of my own limb. They gesture down at my stump, grimace a little bit, and do their best to put on a sympathetic expression as they tell them all about it. It's actually a fun story to tell. I lived in a perfectly ordinary life until one day in my early 20s when I noticed a tiny spot on my forearm. A zit maybe? A spider bite? I didn't know. It was a reddish with a slight purple tint, raised up just a little bit, but not all of that distinguishable from the rest of my skin. It didn't hurt or anything. It was just there. It stayed that way for about a week, and it didn't bug me at all, and I did notice that my arm was getting weaker, though. I was a regular at the gym and found myself struggling to grip the weights with that hand, having that forearm get tired way before the other one, and that kind of thing. I never associated with the little bump on my arm, the bump that was just there. Then one morning I woke up to find the bump had grown during the night. Like it or not, I'd never seen anything like it, and I regarded this new growth as something between panic and detached curiosity. It was now nearly 6 inches in diameter, raised significantly, and filled with a dark liquid of sorts. It looked almost black and far too dark to be blood, but I couldn't tell for sure through the layer of blistered skin. It had spread up into the backside of my elbow. Clearly, it was no longer just there. But still, it wasn't causing me any discomfort. My arm just felt weak. My hand couldn't even grip the steering wheel on my way to the hospital. In my experience, medical professionals are just that, professional. They've been trained to react stoically to the most nauseating phenomena the human body has to offer. But when the doctor on call took a glance at my thing on my arm, he jerked his head forward to take a closer look, widened his eyes, and practically shouted, "Holy shit." Now, I told him I didn't know what it was. He told me he didn't know either. He brought in a few other doctors to take a look, and they were equally baffled, and I could hear snippets of their mumbles to each other. Maybe a dermatologist. It's the color that worries me. Can't rule out that kind of venom. And they weren't helping me feel any better. See, when I go to the doctor, I want him to know exactly what's wrong with me.
Oh, yeah.
I want him to take one look at my arm and tell me the solution is clear, that I need to take this certain pill or make this specific dietary change or see a specialist a couple of towns over. But I was not so lucky. Since this thing bore a passable resemblance to a blister, the doctors eventually decided the best course of action would be to lance it. They all crowded around as the holy shit doctor did the honors. I merely sat more than a little uncomfortable after being gawked at, feeling like a circus freak or a zoo animal.
I bet.
A bucket was placed under my arm, and I could do nothing but watch as a thin, sterilized needle slid into the monstrosity that could have, until that morning, been confused with a small zit. Nothing happened. The needle wasn't very big, and apparently the fluid inside was too vicious to come out a hole that small.
Wow.
But a much bigger needle did the trick. A rush of the stuff all at once began to splash in the bottom of the bucket. It was dark and creamy and stank to high heaven.
Ew.
I suppressed a gag and looked away, wishing I could plug my ears to drown out the splattering sound it made as it spilled into the container. I don't know whether lancing the thing helped or not. All I know is that by the time I collected my prescriptions and driven home from the hospital, more of that nasty shit was starting to fill the empty bag of skin on my arm.
That's gross.
I stopped in my house and grabbed a book, and then drove right back to the hospital. I felt like I might be there for a while. I was right. By the time I walked out of the hospital 22 days later, I had read the entire book, as well as 4 others, not to mention watched 3 seasons of The X-Files. I'd also lost my arm. They lanced the thing a few more times, but it always came back. It got bigger, lots bigger. Eventually it covered my entire hand,
Dang.
wrist, forearm, and elbow. It was making its way up to my shoulder when the doctor decided drastic action was required. See, not only had it grown, but it also was pulsating. My fingernails oozed the stuff 24/7. Once they finally fell off, it was just a steady drip, drip, drip from the tips of my fingers. All the muscles underneath were beginning to atrophy at a rate that alarmed the doctors. My arm was withering and swelling at the same time. It was the effect of my muscles that worried the doctors most. They had no idea what was happening, but at that rate it was spreading up my left arm. They worried it would soon reach my heart, another muscle it could not leave withered in its wake. Finally, they proposed the amputation to me, and I finally agreed. Though I never experienced much pain, I was thoroughly unnerved by the degeneration of my arm, and figured getting rid of the whole thing would be the best way to prevent the condition from spreading to more vital areas of my body.
Excuse me.
We scheduled the amputation. I remained under close watch and treatment from a myriad of specialists. Now, this is the part of the story I don't usually tell people. With most curious inquirers, I tell them that the doctor injected the anesthesia into my vein, and the next thing I knew, I was in the hospital bed with Stumpy. These people are always both satisfied and unsatisfied with my story. It was more bizarre than they had imagined, but they're dying to know what actually caused this strange condition. You and me both, I tell them. We exchange pleasantries and go on about our lives. Now, there's more to the story, more than I ever let on, and I will tell people face to face. I don't know why I feel like I can tell you now, but I suspect the anonymous granted by the internet has something to do with it. I don't have to see your worried faces, no look of polite skepticism masking what's really going on in your head. This guy's fucking nuts. No, I can tell you that the rest of my story, and then close my laptop, immune to any social consequences that result from more personal encounter. Here's what happened next. When they injected the needle into my vein, I began to swim out of consciousness. I began to hear a drum beat, slowly, steady, faint. I asked the doctor if he heard it too, but he just smirked lightly.
Jeez.
Patients are always saying funny things before they go to sleep. It looked seemed to say. The drum beats, deep and ominous, got louder and louder as I drifted away.
Wow.
When I was asleep on the operating table, I dreamt, but dreamt is a weak word. It doesn't do it justice. It was more like a vision. In this vision, the drum beat continued. I was surrounded by a large group of people, each one of whom was plagued by the same malady I had. They looked exhausted with agony, as though they'd suffered the same condition for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Their eyes were downcast, their faces defeated, all were naked, and everything was enshrouded in a gray fog.
Jeez.
Some people had afflicted legs, others arms, faces. Some people were entirely covered from head to foot. One woman cradled an infant in her diseased arms, and as I looked closer, I saw that the child's eyes were swollen and black with the stuff. A thin stream was slowly oozing down from its nostril. Another unfortunate. This one, a watery-eyed young man around my age, was on his hands and knees, hacking and coughing, sticking fingers down his throat and pulling out huge globs and flinging them miserably away. The entire scene was gruesome beyond belief. None of these people seemed aware of me, or one another at least. Each was trapped in their own personal hell. I'm not sure how long I wandered through this crowd for. It felt like hours, but it could have been seconds. I remained somehow detached from all my fellow sufferers.
Jeez.
Until the wound on my arm burst. It was like a faucet, splattering the vile substance at my feet. I backed away from the mess in disgust, glanced up, and found that everybody was staring at me. Their faces were all twisted in a kind of jealous rage. A few of them charged at me as if to attack, but before they reached me with a jolt of pain, much like electricity, sharp, sudden, final coursed through my entire body. I was awoke, confused, and one-armed in my hospital bed. Do you think I'm crazy yet? Well, that's the normal part of my story. A lot of people talk about amputation as though you're losing a loved one. People miss their limbs. They realize they love their limbs. Hell, I was even offered free grief counseling. Actually, the first appointment while I was still in the hospital was mandatory, but it was stupid and I never went back. See, once my diseased appendage was gone, I felt as though a huge weight was lifted from me. I'm not just talking about the 8.7 pounds that was my left arm, although it was a bit of a shock the first time I stepped on a scale post-Stumpy. It was deeper than that. I guess I didn't realize at the time, but the condition of my arm deteriorated, and so did the condition of my mind. I grew irritable, impatient, angry, yet it felt more external than the typical woe is me declaration of long-term hospital patients. It felt as though these emotions were being forced on me, kind of like Frodo in the Ring. Geeky metaphors aside, I was truly relieved to have my arm gone, although the grisly condition never actually caused me much physical discomfort. In fact, I spent most of my time feeling tremendously grateful I'd only lost my left arm. I barely had to relearn how to do anything. I immediately embraced my new disability as part of my identity and went about my life as normal. I told you the normal part of my story. This is where it gets weird. It was a winter day, a bit warmer than usual, a couple years after the operation. To this point, I had no problems with Stumpy, nor did I experience the discomfort sometimes associated with phantom limbs. I did sometimes feel like my arm was still there, though as many people do. Occasionally I thought I felt something brush against it. I easily discarded these instances, though simply happy to avoid the common phantom pain. On this particular day, I think it was near the end of last February, I was walking down the sidewalk on our town's main street. It was lightly raining, and slush covered the concrete and seeping over the soles of my shoes and soaking through my socks. I thought the feeling of wet socks was my least favorite in the world until I experienced what happened next. I felt two hands firmly grasp my wrist, my left wrist. I looked down at the air where the hand used to be, more bewildered than scared. I heard a horn blare alarmingly close behind me. I whipped my head around and saw a car, apparently spinning out of control, heading right towards me. But before I could react, before I could jump, I felt the hands on my wrist yank me hard.
Holy crap.
Easily hard enough to pull someone's arm out of its socket, if they actually had an arm. My body flew out of the vehicle's trajectory and sprawled on the icy pavement as the car slammed into the wall of the barbershop I was walking past. Now I lay there in disbelief. What the fuck just happened? The guy driving the car staggered out and vomited on the sidewalk, and a couple other bystanders rushed over to us. How did you get out of his way that fast? That lady asked me. You're lucky to be... She broke off in mid-sentence, staring in horror at my stump, as though she thought I had lost my arm right then and there.
Oh, right.
Don't worry, it happened a while ago, I told her. I stood up and brushed myself off, but as I looked over at my shoulder, which was hurting quite badly from that pull, I realized she was staring at something that hadn't happened a while ago. My stump, about 6 inches of upper arm, was in tatters. The surgical seams, long since scarred over, had split open.
Oh, wow.
Blood spilled out of the wound. and the rounded off piece of arm bone that remained was protruding loosely from the end, detached from its socket. The last thing I heard before I fainted was the woman's scream.
Yeah.
I went through a lot of complicated medical procedures to put my arm back together, which kept me in the hospital for another 2 miserable weeks.
Jeez.
All the specialists who attended to me during the original stay visited to wish me well, but well was the last thing I felt. The doctors who assumed the vehicle had struck me were utterly baffled by my injury as they learned more. I had a few scrapes from when I hit the ground, but otherwise bore no sign of being hit by a car. Not to mention there was my testimony, the testimony of the driver, still somewhat valuable despite the inebriated condition, and those of several eyewitnesses claiming that I had not been hit at all, but jumped out of the way. The dislocation was what confused the doctors most. They'd never seen an amputated limb, especially one that short, come out of its socket. I don't know how to explain it, one of them told me. Quite simply, the force required to pull a bone this short from a socket, that strong. Hell, I'd have been surprised even if the car had hit you. Did you have any idea how this happened? Any idea what yanked your arm out of place? I didn't want to think I was I didn't want him to think I was crazy or worse, to sign me up for more grief counseling sessions, so I didn't tell him what I felt. I didn't tell him that I would have bet my other arm that something had grabbed me by the wrist, and I no longer have, and pulled me to safety. I simply told him I had no idea what really happened, which was the God's truth. I did my best not to talk about it to people at the hospital. I was grateful to be alive, to be sure, but so thoroughly unnerved by what happened that I could hardly think of anything else. Suddenly, these feelings or something brushing up against my phantom limb became a lot more interesting. And a bit sinister. If I'm being honest, I was totally freaked. Yeah, whatever had pulled my arm saved my life. But
no one can make up that story.
No, but I still had to deal with the fact that something had pulled my arm even though my arm didn't fucking exist. Maybe that counseling wasn't such a bad idea after all. Questions plagued and burdened my mind, not the least of which was a strong suspicion that I was crazy. But there was more. Whose hands had grabbed my wrist? Where was this person? Did my arm still in some way, in some dimension, exist as part of me?
Yeah.
I found myself thinking more and more of the vision I had on the operating table, and all the fellow sufferers meandering around that mysterious place, people who looked as though they'd borne that malady for a terribly long time. These thoughts built, and the burden grew greater, but it wasn't until my last night in the hospital that my mind finally snapped. On this night, I lay in the bed, staring out at the small window of my room and gazing at the clear sky. I began to drift off when I felt a tapping, slow and rhythmic, on the back of my hand. Yeah, that hand. I began to hear the slow and steady drum beat, the one from my vision, again in the room, keeping time with the tapping on my hand. I closed my eyes in horror and shook my head, trying to will the delusion from my mind. But I couldn't. It was no delusion. Eventually the tapping sound stopped, and a pair of hands, a woman's hands, I thought, took my wrist gently, and I tried to yank my hand away by swinging my shoulder back, but the hands gripped tighter. Once I stopped struggling, I felt one of the hands let go. A finger touched the back of my hand and traced something, the letter U. It felt like a pause and then another letter, R-U, U-R, U-R, U-R. As I struggled to wrap my head around these proceedings, 7 more letters were traced on my hand, each bringing another piece of a dawning, horrible realization. That was more than I could take. I screamed and screamed and screamed, and when the nurses burst into my room to see what was the matter, I screamed and screamed some more. It took a few days to convince the hospital to let me out. They thought I was mentally unstable. In fairness to them, they were perhaps right. I'd lost my shit, even with the events the last post transpired. The occasional brush of my non-existent hand I could take. Even the tapping could have been chalked up to a weird nerve phenomena, but there's no alternative explanation to be found for whose hands traced on my own. Was I crazy? I didn't feel crazy, although I doubt many crazy people do, or there was some conscious being, a being of human hands, who had not only pulled me by my phantom limb to safety, but then using the same limb sent me a polite message. I spent the next couple of weeks in a haze, living an deliberate life, just rolling through the days and doing my best to ignore these unanswered questions and vague suspicions, and of course the occasional mysterious brush with my hand. But when the drum beat started again, waking me up in the middle of the night, and the tapping resumed, I could no longer ignore anything else. I was nothing short of terrified. Helplessly I sat and trembled as fingers traced once more on the back of my hand. Whatever it was delivering me another message. A much longer one this time. I closed my eyes in focus, a set of directions to do what? What the fuck? I grasped what the tracing of the message was complete. I couldn't do what I'd just been told, I ran the risk of serious injury or death, to say nothing of having to explain it to the doctors. But then my mind traveled back to the events of the previous month that this thing, whatever it was, saved my life. There was no question about it, no ambiguities to the situation. I owed my every breath to whatever that yanked me out of the path of that car. Then, of course, there was just the first message. You are welcome.
Wow.
Creepy as hell, yes, but also friendly? I couldn't know for sure, but nothing had so far happened to indicate that the being did not have my best interests at heart. Still, the instructions I've been given, I failed to see why they could be of any help to me. Why would I need to reopen my wound? Perhaps my stump was becoming infected, and I needed to relieve the pressure or die, but that still didn't explain why I was ordered to save my blood. I sat up in bed for a moment, drenched in sweat and surrounded by darkness, deliberating over what I should do. Apparently I took too long. The hands grabbed my wrist again, harder this time. 3 letters were traced on my hand in broad, sweeping, almost angry strokes. Then in a single line and underneath its lone and forceful tap, an exclamation point. That final message worked. Whatever the situation was, I felt it to be sufficiently urgent. I scrambled out of bed and made my way towards the kitchen, where I grabbed a medium-sized Tupperware container, placed it on the counter using the smallest pair of scissors I had. I sliced easily through the stitching of my arm, pulled the thread from its holes. A few drops of blood dripped out, but the wound was mostly scarred over. I knew what had to be done next. I took a deep breath, and with a sharp kitchen knife, began to carve along the healing surgical seam. It felt unpleasant, to say the least, but I made no sound. I held my stump over the Tupperware, letting the blood dribble into the plastic for a while. Once the container was nearly full, I realized I had no way of stopping the blood flow, which was quickly getting out of control. In panic, I slammed the lid onto the container and watched helplessly as blood, perhaps a bit darker than usual, spill out onto the counter, the floor,
Yikes.
everywhere I went. Finally, I grabbed a bath towel and managed to wrap it firmly around my stump, trying to tie it off at the end. And it became clear while my instructions included seeing a doctor. Carrying the Tupperware full of blood in my only hand and wearing my keys around my neck, I hurried to my car, ignoring the bitter nighttime air despite having no jacket, and drove to the hospital in a state of half delirium. When I reached the front desk of the emergency room, I held the Tupperware casually near my waist. The rest of me was like a spectacle, and the ER so crowded and bustling, nobody even noticed. I checked in, a bit pale from loss of blood, and the urgency of the situation was not lost on the receptionist. She directed that I go straight to the office of the doctor in charge of my case. I walked through the halls of the hospital quickly with purpose, but as I made to run down the corridor of my doctor's office, I felt another painful tug of my arm. Not hard enough to rip my arm out of its socket again, thank God, but hard enough to turn me down another hall and another and another. I had no idea where in the hospital I was, nor why I was supposed to be there. The tugs finally led me to an empty hallway. They turned towards the door and stopped. That was it. I didn't know what I was doing there, but nonetheless, burdened with a sickly feeling of guilt, I glanced discreetly down both ends of the hallway, checking for hospital personnel. Nothing. Head swimming. Exhausted, I reluctantly reached for the doorknob and snuck inside. The room was mostly empty, save for a small surgical table holding several bottles of blood.
What?
I looked at the bottles, then the Tupperware still clenched in my hand. A dawning realization swept over me. No, I said aloud. No, I can't. It was less than 2 weeks later the doctor called me. I knew it. It was only a matter of time before I heard something. How are you? He asked me. I'm fine. Everything seems to be, healing like it should. Have you, he paused, concern in his voice, yet unsure how he should word this next part. I knew it was coming. Taken out your stitches like a dumbass? Cut yourself again? Had another episode? Good choice, I thought. Tactful. No, everything's normal, I replied. Good. Listen, I'm calling to let you know something. We've had a few patients recently contract symptoms that are quite similar to what you had on your arm. As you know, all the tests we ran on you were inconclusive, but we're at a loss. We don't want to be chopping limbs off all over the place, you understand? I was silent. Anyway, I'm calling because I hope you do me a favor and come back to the hospital. We'd like to investigate a little further. I found I could barely speak. Investigate? I asked feebly. I imagined sitting in a dimly lit room, bleak concrete walls surrounding me, and a detective sitting across the table. He'd wave a security tape in my face, maybe ask me where I was, roughly at 3 o'clock in the morning last Wednesday, a shit-eating grin on his face. Yes, run some blood tests, brain scans, anything to help us understand what happened to you physically, and how you've essentially been able to make a full recovery. It's a long shot, but frankly, we're desperate. We've never seen anything like this, so we're dealing with uncharted waters here. I agreed to come in the next day. That night, the drumbeat sounded once more. The tracing on my hand began. I was implored to do it again. I was racked with guilt over poisoning the hospital's blood, over afflicting innocent people with this terrible malady. Yet my thoughts at this moment were not with them. No, they were with the people in my vision. The miserable wretches, scabbed and scarred and covered in the most vile substance imaginable. I felt that even though my arm was gone, I was still somehow in some way part of them. The feeling made my blood run cold. So I spoke aloud, perhaps to my own psychotic mind, but also perhaps to an actual being, invisible and undetectable, yet completely and undeniably real. You know what? I'm not going to do it. I'm not. I'm done. I closed my eyes and listened carefully for what I'm sure. For anything, some angry reprisal, maybe even some malicious torturing my phantom limb. But there was nothing, only silence. Somehow, that felt like the worst response of all. I stood on my balcony drinking a mug of tea, looking out over the sunrise. The morning air chilled me, but I wore no jacket, no sweats. I let it wash over me, invigorate me. Even if I had another arm, I wouldn't have hugged myself with it. I peered over the edge of my balcony to the grass below, covered in frost, and smiled a bit. I had an appointment at the hospital later that day, but I could relax for now.
Jeez. That's some story.
It goes on for a while, but...
Nobody could make this up.
What's fascinating, though, is wherever his phantom limb is, someone else grabbed him and pulled away from the car.
Yeah. It could have been... Some people would say guardian spirit, guardian angel, or his second self.
He could exist in two places at once.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, whatever's going on in the other one with all those people in that substance, it's kind of nasty, but... Excuse me.
Well, you've heard in medieval times people talk about people having second fingers or second thumbs growing, and they thought it was weird, but these people, the odd times that it was recorded or talked about, it was like a second person. People reported feeling like they had a second self.
Well, and that may be also connected to congenial twins. Or that mysterious twin that's inside someone's body that they don't find out about it till they die.
Till they die, yeah.
This other functional and living being existed their whole life inside their body. I don't know. You got to wonder if the energy isn't connecting us to different places. One physical world here, maybe there's a physical world somewhere else, but the energy connects us through all of it.
Right.
I don't know. It's an interesting... That story was a little long.
It's a little long, but I've even heard of tumors where they take out a tumor and it appears to be growing something else, like a lot of veins. I even heard teeth and hair growing in a tumor that they took it out.
Yep.
There's more than one way of second self or second cells growing another being.
And maybe that wasn't supposed to happen. You're supposed to have one, but for some reason your blueprint fucked up and you have two.
It can happen. It can happen, yeah.
It's just interesting, but I think Phantom Limbs definitely has a connection to a lot of that somehow.
Yeah.
That we just don't know about yet. But
right, and then the actual limb where the cells actually have a message that I'm supposed to be growing again, and they start growing, and they find that the chopped off limb has something growing, and the cells are actually growing something, and just like a plant growing another flower or another leaf. So
there's a lot more than we just don't know.
We just don't know.
And I'm sure there's stuff we'll probably never be able to figure out or know, but it's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. You never know what advances medical science can make, and that includes phantom limbs. Maybe they'll study it more and use it for to help people. I hope so.
Yep.
Yeah. Wow.
All right, folks. There's another episode of Ecto Portal, and I guess until next time, we'll say goodbye.
Bye. Everybody. See you next week.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.